This story, Demolition Day, was inspired by an old barn that used to exist on the 401 on the way to Toronto. It said Medill Farm on it, and then one day it wasn't there anymore. Demolition Day. The bucket of the backhoe clawed at the remains of the old bank barn, like a cat covering the soil after doing its business in the garden. The old structure had stood for more than a century and a half, for most of that period having housed cattle, and above them their feed and bedding. With the beckoning encroachment of suburbia and light industry only a mile away, the 100-acre farm had been sold to developers when old Jack McCurdy died. Neither the house nor the barn had received much in the way of upkeep or TLC in the latter decades of McCurdy's tenure. And after he sold the farm, the barn stood derelict and decaying for the next 20 years. Its roof gradually sagged and eventually collapsed at the northeast corner, rotting the century elm beams upon exposure to the rain. The surrounding fields were overtaken first by goldenrod and Michaelmas daisies, and latterly by scrubby white poplars and Manitoba maples. The dreams of successive owners of the property concerning development were being realized at last. Far from the $1,000 per acre paid to old man McCurdy, its price had risen steadily with each change of speculative ownership. The new warehouses now under construction on what had been the neighbouring farm had brought the value of the McCurdy property to its present pinnacle of millions of dollars. The old farmhouse sat boarded up, ready for destruction. Now Demolition Day had finally arrived. The land surrounding barn and farmhouse was being raped and scraped by earth-moving equipment. Its topsoil had been collected in great piles for eventual sale to landscaping companies. The barn's corrugated steel roof now lay in a tangled heap, ready for transport to a scrap metal merchant. Any salvageable boards and beams had been purchased and had been taken away for reuse by a heritage home renovator. Now the backhoe began to claw its way through what had once been the floor of the upper level, ripping its way through the old 2x10s. In an awkward corner, next to the former granary, lay a mound of ancient straw, apparently undisturbed for decades. As the bucket drew the splintered wood and old straw towards him, the operator noticed the flash of something white, and the skull of a human skeleton rolled out of the straw towards him. Shutting off the motor, the operator climbed down to look and saw several other bones jumbled up amid the newly disturbed straw. Further demolition work had to be put on hold, pending the arrival of the police, who installed yellow "Do Not Cross" tape all around the site. With the aid of staff from the coroner's office, the straw was carefully sifted and all of the bones were removed. Preliminary examination suggested the remains had probably lain there for 20 or 30 years. The skeleton was identified to be that of a male, probably in his 20s. There were broken bones at the back of the skull. They hadn't been caused by excavation of the backhoe. It appeared that the young man had been bludgeoned to death. This was a case of murder. Inquiries as to the murdered man's identity, involving searches of records of missing persons from the relevant era, did not uncover any promising leads. All the former farming inhabitants of the area had long since died or relocated, and so it was some time before an old piece of scuttlebutt resurfaced. Old man McCurdy had been notorious for his explosive temper. His wife Joan had been widely believed to be a battered woman. This was in the days before such matters were normally of concern to the police or to social workers. McCurdy's daughter had left home in her teens to escape the old man's tirades, but she was now deceased of an untimely brain tumour. The fate of the younger child, Arthur, that's Art, had been the subject of a curiosity all those years ago. Art had been browbeaten into staying to help his father until his early 20s. Their relationship was far from smooth. Art could never carry out any tasks to his father's satisfaction, and loud and raucous arguments could frequently be heard as far away as both neighbouring farms, and it was reported sotto voce that old man McCurdy had made threats of bodily harm and worse on more than one occasion. Then one day young Art was no longer at the farm. His father never reported his disappearance. Nobody knew where he went, and he never claimed what remained of the family's diminutive fortune after McCurdy died. Tongues had muttered darkly as to whether young Art had really moved away, or whether something more sinister had occurred. The discovery of the skeleton in the barn eventually reached the ears of the other ancients who had sold up and moved away. Their tongues began to wag once more to the effect that old McCurdy had killed his son in a fit of rage and hidden his body under the old straw at the barn. No wonder no missing persons report had ever been filed. And in the absence of Jack McCurdy through death, there was no limit on how lurid and slanderous might be the accounts of his presumed killing of young Art. As far as local gossip was concerned, the case of Art's disappearance was now solved, just as they had always known. This story eventually came to the ears of the police, but it proved uncommonly difficult to test the hypothesis. DNA evidence was indeed available from the remains found at the barn, having survived degradation in tooth dentine and bone marrow. But material that might or might not forge a link to the McCurdys was elusive. McCurdy himself was long dead, and any of his personal items, such as hairbrushes, that might have yielded samples of his DNA, had no monetary or sentimental value to anyone. They'd gone out with the garbage when his room at the Willows, a long-term care facility, had been cleared out. Both Joan and her daughter Mavis had left this world. So also had the McCurdy's elderly dentist, whose records on the McCurdy family were in any case woefully incomplete. There being no way to connect the young man's remains to Jack Curdy's son Arthur, the case was declared unresolved, although since it was a murder investigation, it remained technically open. Brief mention of these events was made in the national press, a couple of paragraphs on page 7 of the National Post, and noticed by coincidence Ed Bright, who lived at the time near Lethbridge with his wife and 3 teenage children. Ed had moved out west some 20 years earlier, having brought with him almost nothing but the clothes on his back. He'd found work at a small Saskatchewan meat packing plant, one that inspected provincially, if at all, rather than through the federal meat inspection program. Many of the cattle that passed through its doors either would have been, or indeed already had been, condemned at a federally inspected plant as unfit for human consumption. The pay was low, the safety and hygiene standards, if anything, were lower, but the wages were paid weekly in cash without paperwork or deductions. A completely different and unrelated Edwin Bright, despite his happy-sounding name, had lived a short but cheerless existence in Melville, Saskatchewan. Frail from birth, he had developed a fatal case of pneumonia shortly after his 2nd birthday. Following his death and burial, and overcome by an unshakable grief, his deeply sorrowing parents had returned to their native England, in the hope that the return to familiar surroundings might put their tragedy behind them. At the time that the impecunious young man was working in the Saskatchewan meat packing plant, provincial records of births, deaths and marriages were not computerized. Lacking identification, he began a search of nearby cemeteries, in search of a deceased male child born around the same time as himself. In those days, it was possible for him to apply for replacement of his so-called lost birth certificate and begin a new life as Edwin George Bright. Birth certificate in hand, Ed opened a bank account to deposit the money that he had saved by frugal living from his under-the-counter job with the meat packing plant. Eventually, and now equipped with a social insurance number, he was able to move out of the employment shadows to work in the more formal economy. Indeed, by the time of writing, Ed had become a solid citizen, whose identification by now had been augmented to include credit cards and a Canadian passport. He had met his wife when he moved to Calgary to undertake engineering studies at Southern Alberta Institute of Technology. I must now explain that the man now known as Ed Bright had found it necessary to leave his Ontario home on account of a certain misadventure in his personal life. In his youth, he had become involved in an attempt to extort money from a rich but demented widower by pretending to be his long-lost grandson. The scheme had been aborted when the man's children discovered they had an imaginary but needy relative. However, a drifter by the name of Todd Leary became aware of Art's involvement and began to blackmail him. The two men arranged to meet at the McCurdy barn to exchange the money demanded by Leary. An argument ensued during which Leary was killed by a blow to the head with a shovel. The other party to the altercation immediately left town with the money that he had brought to hand over, some $200. In conventional and seemly stories, malefactors are found out and or brought to justice in the denouement. In the present narrative, this was not to be. After the discovery of the skeleton in the National Post, Ed Bright pursued an interest in events back in Ontario through the online pages of the local press. As a Southern Albertan, he was surprisingly preoccupied in the investigation into the murder of the John Doe in faraway Ontario. Eventually, he experienced a considerable sense of relief when his online lections revealed the de facto closure of the police probe into the matter. In point of fact, until the previous few weeks, Edwin Bright of southern Alberta had almost completely forgotten that he had at one time borne the name of Arthur McCurdy. So, how does a man react to the news that he has literally gotten away with murder? Should he celebrate his good fortune by taking his family out to dinner at a very elegant restaurant, but without telling them the reason? Maybe a night out with his closest friends and a bottle, or maybe two, of a particularly expensive single malt whiskey? No, either course of action might provoke questions as to the motives for this extravagance. Should he instead seek the solace of the confessional and a priestly absolution of his sins? Possibly, but then he'd never actually been brought up as a churchgoer. His only experience of confession was what he gleaned from movies. Might he salve his conscience by making a substantial anonymous donation to charity, perhaps one devoted to work among teenagers who suffered from mental, physical, or emotional abuse? Perhaps, but how do you go about identifying such an organization without drawing attention to yourself? It was a lack of clear direction rather than innate apathy that led Edwin Bright to do nothing. Gradually, the memories of Todd Leary and the events that had transpired at the McCurdy barn receded to the remotest recesses of his consciousness, precisely where they had resided prior to his adventitious perusal of those insignificant paragraphs on page 7 of the National Post.